Good morning. This is Dr. Cindy Bacon with the second video that I'm going to record, and this is clinical practicum orientation to the Master of Science in Nursing Administration courses. This is going to be a generic presentation for clinical practicums that cover all of the courses in our MSN concentration. For specific information about your clinical, please refer to your syllabus in your individual course. So I'm going to go ahead and start talking about the clinical practicum because I know that you probably have a lot of questions, particularly those of you that are new. So each course in our MSN administration program has a clinical component. You need to first be aware of how many clinical hours each course has so that you have the proper amount that need to be completed. For example, in NUR 540, Financial Management in Healthcare, there are 45 clinical hours that are required. Another example of a course that's in the semester that I'm currently talking to you about is NUR 606, which is Advanced Quality and Safety, and this course also has 45 clinical hours in the practicum experience. The practicum experience itself is a pass-fail or satisfactory, non-satisfactory grade. You are required in courses with a clinical practicum that you must pass both the course and the clinical practicum in order to be successful in completing the course. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the things that need to happen in the clinical practicum. First of all, you work directly with a preceptor of your choosing. The preceptor does need to be someone who is master's prepared. It does not specifically have to be a Master of Science in Nursing Administration degree, although we do highly encourage that. However, there has been sort of a waxing and waning in the nursing environment over the years where for some periods, nurse leaders were encouraged to get other degrees outside of nursing, for example, a master's in business administration or an MBA, or a master's in health administration, an MHA, instead of the nursing degree. So those degrees are certainly applicable and appropriate. If you have any questions about whether your preceptor's degree is appropriate, just check with your course professor and we'll be happy to go over that with you and make sure that it's appropriate. So when you pick your preceptor, you need to pick someone who is going to help you achieve the goals for your particular course. All courses have student learning objectives for the course and clinical component of the course. And then most courses, you also will then determine your own specific objectives for the clinical practicum itself. Dr. Jenkins has posted a nice review of how to determine your clinical objectives, and I'm going to try and bring that up on my other screen if you'll have patience with me. Let's see. Here we go. Objectives for clinical practicum. So when you're writing your learning objectives for your clinical practicum, you need to make sure that you do them in a particular way. We're going to talk a little bit about how to write them in terms of Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy is simply a way of listing out how people learn and the different levels of learning. For example, the lowest level of learning is knowledge. The highest level of learning is synthesis and evaluation. And there's a continuum. There's actually a reference here that Dr. Jennings has posted, and I know I've posted it into my courses, that's called Major's Tips on Instructional Objectives by R.F. Major, M-A-G-E-R. So this is a good thing for you to review. It talks about how to state behaviors and list your learning objectives, and it also gives helpful tips on good things and not so good things to do when you're doing your learning objectives. So the ideal learning objective will go through Bloom's taxonomy and will match whatever level that you are at with whatever objectives you write. A learning objective is much more specific than a goal. The ideal learning objective has 3 parts. First, there should be a measurable verb, an action verb. Second, there should be the important condition, if any, under which the performance is to occur. And third, there needs to be some criteria of acceptable performance. Sometimes you will not see the criteria or condition specified if they're particularly obvious. However, often adding a condition and or criteria improves the clarity of the learning objective. If you look further down on the document which we post in all of our clinical courses, you will see some examples of how to write nursing objectives for the clinical practicum. And here's the example that Dr. Jenkins provided. Objective 1, contrast different leadership styles employed by nurse administrators and other leadership in the healthcare setting. That's a good objective. Contrast. It says that you're going to look at two or more different types of objectives and compare and contrast them. The specific underneath the objectives, then you need to have the steps and the things that you're going to do to accomplish them. So under that objective of contrasting different leadership styles, first objective, attend a diverse combination of meetings, interviews, and interactions with the preceptors to gain experience with all type of leadership, both nursing and non-nursing. A second objective might be observe the effects of the various leadership styles on the work environment, productivity, and organizational goals. Again, following along with the learning objectives posted in your course in Canvas. Number 3, shadow other leaders as recommended by the preceptor to gain additional experiences and viewpoints. And number 4, participate with preceptor in functions that have different levels of leadership involved, possibly ranging from the executive level to the direct line manager. So this is an example of how you can write your learning objectives. What I suggest is that you start with the course objectives and utilize them as a guide. Each person's objectives are going to be different, and you'll need to submit your objectives to your course professor and have those approved before you begin your clinical. Then, when you write up your clinical journals, you're going to address these objectives and how you're achieving them, whether you've met them, what progress you've made to the goals, and there may be some occasions where you meet some of them, but you don't meet all of those particular things under each objective, and you may want to carry that specific thing that you didn't meet into the next semester, and that's certainly okay. Let's talk a little bit about the preceptor and practicum journal, since we're talking about writing objectives. So, as I said, each student must complete the designated number of clinical hours associated with the course, and that will be listed right at the top of your syllabus. You will need to review and reference the MSN Administration Concentration Plan of Study, and this will tell you which courses have which requirements. Each student must identify and confirm a nurse leader to serve as a preceptor for the experience. As I said before, preceptors must hold a master's degree. They can have a doctorate degree, preferably in nursing, but not required. Students are allowed to complete their clinical hours in their place of employment, but this is not guaranteed, nor is it required. We generally recommend that you identify a preceptor who is not your immediate supervisor. One of the reasons behind this is that you get to see different viewpoints, and sometimes there can be conflicts between the actual supervisor that you work with every day, and not always, but sometimes there can be, because that person is evaluating your performance, and sometimes students don't feel like they can get the best experience with someone that's already in their work area, but it is possible. It is the student's responsibility to get several pieces of paperwork before you can begin clinical. First off, you need to contact the preceptor, and you need to be in discussions with your course professor to determine whether this preceptor is appropriate. Once you talk to your preceptor and they agree to be your preceptor for the experience. The two pieces of paperwork are, number one, the preceptor agreement. The preceptor agreement form is a form that gets filled out where you sign it, your preceptor signs it, and it basically says that what you both agree to and what the terms are. Secondly, your preceptor needs to submit a curriculum vitae, a CV, or resume. Same document. In the academic world, we call them CVs. Typically in the business world, they're called resumes. But a vitae needs to be submitted to the professor before clinical begins. Likewise, you have to have that preceptor agreement in place before clinical begins. It is possible to use, if you're taking more than one course at a time, to use the same preceptor for 2 clinical courses. However, each course has to have a separate preceptor agreement form, and each course instructor has to have an individual copy of the CV or resume. You also need to understand that if you have the same preceptor across several courses, for example, if you are taking 606 Advanced Quality and 540 Financial Management in the same semester, both of those courses have 45 hours of clinical that is required. So the preceptor, if you use the same one, would have to do 90 hours of clinical with you across both courses. That's a big commitment, and it's possible, but you need to make sure the preceptor is very clear in understanding their responsibilities. How you divide up the hours, how you schedule them across the semester is fairly flexible. If you have any questions, please check with your course professor and make sure that you do spread it out somewhat across the semester, because most of you are working and you need to figure out work hours versus clinical student hours. I want to say a little bit about that before we move forward. It is very, very important when you are working in the student role that we clearly distinguish between student and employee role, to the point of you need to wear your student ID badge. You need to identify yourself as a student, particularly if you are doing your student practicum in an area, either in the unit where you already work or the facility where you already work. It needs to be very clear that you're doing these activities as a student and not with your job that you say for example, you're a nurse manager in the facility. You need to be very clear and say, I'm not wearing my nurse manager hat, I'm wearing my student hat. And that sounds silly, but it's important because we need to separate those hours. You cannot double dip and take work hours and count them as student hours. Student hours are student hours, work hours are work hours, and they have to be completely separate. So how do we document these learning objectives that we just talked about a few minutes ago? This is where we get back to the practicum journal. You do need to log your clinical hours, and you will do that in the practicum journal. The journal will have a section in it, and you can look at the specific rubric for the practicum journal. The practicum journal will document the practicum experience. So you'll list your hours, and then you're going to document your progress toward the objectives in your journal. I'm going to try and bring up that form on my other computer, if you'll give me just a minute, so we can talk specifically about that. Hang on just a second. Okay, here we go. Clinical journal rubric. And I'm going to try and turn the camera so you can have a look at this. Hopefully this will work. This is the screen, and I don't really think you can see that very well, so I'm going to talk about it. The journal guidelines. First of all, you have to have 3 measurable learning objectives with appropriate strategies for meeting each objective. You need to then describe the clinical experience, talk about in just a reflective kind of narrative style. What did you learn this particular week or session or meeting? What did you go in expected to learn? Was it different than what you expected? That sort of thing. There's also a discussion about teams, because we are a practice profession and we work in groups. We don't tend to just work alone. So there needs to be some discussion about observations that you make within the interprofessional team and how you have experienced and perhaps viewed collaborative decision making, reflection on your strengths, on your areas for improvement as a nurse leader in facilitating team building and fostering collaboration. The reason we include this in each one of our clinical journals is, again, because of the importance of teamwork and your role as a leader in leading teams. There's also a section on application of the evidence. We do ask that you summarize and apply 2 research articles for each journal that are specific to whatever clinical experience. So, for example, if one of your learning objectives is about conflict resolution, perhaps some of the things under that might be observing your preceptor and how they handle conflict resolution. You may talk about a situation in which you handled conflict, how you did, what you might want to do better in the future. In that case, you might want to find an article, a research article on conflict resolution, provide a brief summary of what the article says, and then talk about how it applies to your clinical experience and your work. We also want to make sure that you look at the ANA scope and standards of practice for nursing administration, discuss which standard applies to whatever clinical experience that you're talking about. Make a note in your journal about what happened, what you did, how you felt about it, and what rationale that you applied to it. You need to discuss any opportunities for growth and development as a leader. And then finally, your journal should conclude with next steps, a review of what clinical objectives you've come up with. What is your direction for the remaining clinical hours? For example, if your course has 3 clinical journals that are required, and this will vary course to course, in the first journal, you want to try and talk about what progress you made. It's not expected that you've met all of those behaviors because you've only at a certain point in the semester. By the end of the semester, for the most part, you should have achieved the goals, or you can talk about which goals are going to carry over. So where am I in the process? What is your reflection on the experiences that have happened? What is my current growth as a nurse administrator leader? And talk about that in your final section of the clinical journal. Again, I refer you to that rubric. I'm sorry that you couldn't see it, but it is posted in all of your courses. So the practicum journal is going to be where you document this information, accrue your hours, provide your discussions. I want to direct you to your course calendar for specific due dates and times for submissions. This will vary course to course. All journal entries will be submitted via Canvas. Do not email them directly to the faculty member unless they specifically ask you to do so. Again, please refer to the Practicum journal instructions under course content and see your faculty member if you have any questions. Now, there are documentation requirements. And for those of you that are beginning, a course right now, you know there's a lot of things that have to happen. There's 2 things that have to happen in order for you to be cleared to start clinical. Number 1, you have to be cleared by the School of Nursing. Philip Simpson is the person that you will hear from the Office of Student Affairs. Things like your immunizations, your CPR status, etc., TB tests, all those kind of things that are administrative type documents. He has to have a copy of those, and you need to do it every single course, every single semester. So that information, once all those things are satisfied, you will receive clearance from your professor that you are cleared from the School of Nursing. The second step is on the clinical practicum side, wherever you choose to work with your preceptor. First off, most importantly, we have to determine, is there a contract between UNCG School of Nursing and the clinical agency? Well, you may think that there is, but you might be surprised that we don't have contracts. There's thousands. I don't know about thousands, but I know there's hundreds of contracts. Diana McHenry does those mainly for the master's programs, and it's a constantly moving target. They don't just stay in effect forever. Typically every year they have to be reviewed and re-signed by lawyers, and if we do not have a clinical agreement in place with your agency, it's a very complex, lengthy process to get it in place. So one of the reasons that we go through the process that we do with you is to make sure that that contract is in place. There are occasionally measures that we can take for temporary contracts for agencies that are new, and we will work with you on that. But the reason that we are such sticklers for that is because it's extremely detailed, laborious, and it has to be in place from a legal perspective before we can let you begin. Even if You're an employee of the institution. Doesn't matter. Remember, you're in a completely different role. If we send somebody to a clinical practicum experience and there is not a contract or agreement in place, this can jeopardize every single contract that the School of Nursing has with every single agency, from the undergraduate to the master's to the PhD level. So it's imperative that we have it in place, and that's why we're kind of crazy about making sure all that gets done. So once the contract is in place, then we make sure that you have the agreement from the preceptor and yourself that gets signed and returned, and then the preceptor vitae. Once the School of Nursing requirements are done, and you're cleared by Philip, and the other requirements, the contract, the agreement, and the vitae are all done, then you will get the green light from your preceptor, not your preceptor, from your instructor to proceed. Once you get that green light, the next step is to develop your course objectives. You want to make sure that before you go to your first clinical day with your preceptor that you've got your objectives, at least some rough objectives. You can discuss them with your preceptor, certainly, and they can have input into those objectives, but they have to be approved once you develop them by your professor. Remember, your preceptor is there to help you, but they are not grading you. That is the job of your course professor. And if you have any questions about that, we do reach out as professors to the preceptors, but we do know that there are sometimes when we need to get involved and help you with that kind of process. So please, we will work with you. Let us know. That's what we're here for. All right, so we've talked about clinical. We've talked about the practicum. We've talked about the journals that are required. We talked about the preceptors. We talked about how you get cleared. We talked about the process. This should be most of the information that you need for beginning your clinical. Again, if you have any other questions, please feel free to contact your course professor and we'll get you started. Thanks. Welcome to clinical.